June 6th, 1944, 0630 hours. 3 miles off the coast of Normandy, France. The air tastes of diesel exhaust and salt spray, a greasy, acrid fog that clings to the back of your throat. You are standing in a floating plywood box, 36 feet of mahogany and oak, and the English Channel is doing its best to swallow you whole. To your left and right, 32 men, boys really, are packed so tightly that their M1 Garons clatter against their steel helmets with every violent lurch of the sea. Some are praying, most are vomiting into the 6 inches of bilge water sloshing around their boots. Ahead of you, through the spray-flecked vision slit, the horizon is a jagged line of smoke and thunder. That is Omaha Beach. Between you and that sand lies 1,000 yards of hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and teller mines, all backed by the concrete eyes of the Atlantic Wall. The German MG-42s are already chattering, their tracers skipping across the gray swells like angry fireflies. You feel the rhythmic thump-slap of the flat hull against the 4-foot waves. It is a violent, bone-jarring vibration that hums through the soles of your boots. To any sane naval architect in 1939, this vessel shouldn't be here. It's too small, it's made of wood, and it's headed straight for a shoreline where no deep-draft ship could ever hope to go. For decades, the world's greatest military minds had viewed an invasion like this as a mathematical impossibility. If you wanted to land an army, you needed a port. You needed cranes, deep-water piers, and the massive infrastructure of a city like Cherbourg or Le Havre. But the Germans knew this. They had turned every French harbor into a fortress of steel and concrete. If the Allies tried to take a port from the sea, they would be slaughtered in the Narrows. The dilemma was a chokehold on Allied strategy. You can't land without a port, but you can't take a port without landing an army first. In the high-walled offices of the Navy's Bureau of Ships, the admirals had been scratching their heads for years. Their designs were clumsy, heavy steel lighters that grounded far from the shore, forcing soldiers to wade through neck-deep water while being mown down. They were boats built by men who understood the open ocean, but had no idea how to dance with a shoreline. But as the coxswain of this plywood craft throttles up the gray marine diesel engine, he isn't thinking about the Bureau of Ships. He is thinking about a man in New Orleans who claimed he could build a boat that could run over a floating log and land a tank in a forest if he had to. The boat you are in is the LCVP, the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. To the men inside, it's just the Higgins Boat. It is a shallow draft marvel with a spoonbill bow and a protected propeller that refuses to clog in the sand. It is the only reason the thousands of ships behind you aren't just targets for German U-boats. Suddenly, the hull screeches. The sound of sand grinding against wood screams through the floorboards. The boat shutter stalls, the engine roaring in reverse to keep the stern from swinging. This is the moment. The impossible is about to meet its maker. The coxswain reaches for the lever, the steel cable winds, and as the bow ramp begins to fall, exposing 32 shivering Americans to the direct fire of the WN-62 Stronghold, the story of how this plywood box came to be begins 1,000 miles away in the mosquito-infested swamps of the American South.
The ramp hits the surf with a heavy, hollow splash. But the genesis of this moment didn't begin with a military contract. It began with a man who hated losing to a log. Long before the English Channel was a battlefield, the backwaters of the Louisiana bayous were a different kind of war zone. It is 1920, and Andrew Jackson Higgins is standing on a humid New Orleans pier, a cigar clamped between his teeth, watching his timber-hauling boats get stuck in the sucking mud of the Mississippi Delta. Higgins is a force of nature, a hard-drinking, fast-talking Irishman with a temper like a pressure cooker and a mind for fluid dynamics that no university could teach. He isn't an admiral, he's a businessman who needs to get mahogany and cypress logs out of places where the water is more mud than liquid. In the 1920s, if a boat hit a sandbar or a floating stump, the propeller shattered, the engine stalled, and the profit vanished. Higgins decides to build something the world says is impossible, a boat that can navigate in inches of water, jump over obstacles, and reverse off a bank without burying its tail. He retreats to his workshop, a chaotic den of sawdust and blueprints. The Eureka boat is born from frustration. Most boat hulls are V-shaped to slice through waves, but Higgins designs a spoonbill bow, a rounded, upward curving front that allows the boat to ride over debris rather than crashing into it. More importantly, he creates a recessed tunnel for the propeller. He tucks the spinning blades up inside the hull, protected from the mud and logs by a semicircular housing. To test it, he doesn't go to a laboratory. He takes the Eureka out to the most treacherous, log-choked marshes he can find. He guns the engine, hurtling the craft at a floating cypress log at 20 knots. The boat doesn't splinter, it leaps. It slides over the obstacle like a greased pig and settles back into the water on the other side, the propellers still humming, untouched by the hazard. He sells these boats to oil prospectors, fur trappers, and even rum runners who need to disappear into the shallow grass where the Coast Guard's deep draft cutters can't follow. By the late 1930s, the Eureka is the undisputed king of the swamp. But as the clouds of war gather over Europe and the Pacific, the United States Marine Corps is facing a terrifying reality. They're looking at the islands of the Pacific and the coastlines of Europe and realizing they have no way to get their men onto the sand. The Japanese are already using specialized landing craft with bow ramps, while the U.S. Navy is still experimenting with bureau boats, clumsy, heavy steel lighters that weigh too much, draw too much water, and frequently stall the moment they touch a beach. In 1941, the Navy's Bureau of Ships, BUShips, is convinced they have the answer. They've spent millions on a complicated, heavy design. They view Higgins as a swamp rat, a loudmouthed civilian from New Orleans with no formal naval education. They don't want his plywood toys. But Higgins knows something the admirals don't. The ocean floor near a beach isn't a flat parking lot. It is a shifting, treacherous landscape of sandbars and hidden reefs, exactly like the Louisiana Bayou. He takes his Eureka boat to the Navy trials in Norfolk, Virginia. He watches as the official bureau boats ground themselves hundreds of yards from the shore, leaving soldiers to jump into deep water where they sink under the weight of their packs. Then, Higgins takes the helm of his Eureka. He hits the beach at full throttle, the spoonbill bow riding high. The boat slides right onto the dry sand. With a roar of the engine, he shifts into reverse, the protected propeller pulling the craft off the beach in seconds. The Marines are floored. It is the most maneuverable boat they have ever seen. But there is one glaring problem. The soldiers still have to jump over the sides. In a hail of machine gun fire, that 2-second climb over the gunwale is a death sentence. Higgins returns to New Orleans, his mind racing. He has the hull, he has the engine, now he needs a door. He sits down with his lead engineer and sketches a radical change. He chops off his beloved spoonbill bow and replaces it with a massive hinged steel ramp. The admirals scream that it will ruin the boat's buoyancy, that it will scoop up the ocean and sink. Higgins ignores them. He builds it in a feverish burst of activity, and when the ramp drops for the first time on a practice beach, the impossible boat becomes the LCVP. The swamp rat has just given the Allies the key to the continent.
1941, 10 a.m. The windswept coastline of Norfolk, Virginia. The Atlantic swell is a bruised purple today, heavy and unpredictable. On the shoreline, a group of high-ranking naval officers, men with gold braid on their caps and decades of tradition in their blood, stand with their arms crossed. They are watching a disaster unfold. One of the Navy's own designs, a heavy, steel-hulled landing craft birthed by the Bureau of Ships, is currently wallowing in the surf like a wounded whale. Its propeller is choked with sand, its engine is screaming in a high-pitched, mechanical agony, and the Marines on board are jumping into water that is 6 feet deep, their heavy packs dragging them toward the bottom. Standing apart from the brass is Andrew Higgins. He looks out of place in his sweat-stained suit, a fedora shoved back on his head and a cigar glowing like a small coal in the salt air. To the admirals, he is an interloper, a civilian who thinks he can out-engineer the United States Navy with a pile of Louisiana plywood. "Your boat is a toy, Higgins," one of the officers mutters, gesturing toward the sleek wooden Eureka boat bobbing nearby. "It's made of wood. It won't stand up to a single burst of machine gun fire, and it certainly won't carry a jeep." Higgins doesn't argue. He simply signals to his coxswain. The Eureka boat roars to life. Unlike the Bureau's steel monster, which draws nearly 4 feet of water, the Higgins boat seems to sit on top of the waves. It streaks toward the beach at twice the speed of its competitor. The spoonbill bow hits the sand with a confident thud, and the boat slides effortlessly up onto the dry ground. Within seconds, the engine shifts, the protected propeller clears the sand, and the boat is backing away, ready for another run. The Marines on the beach are cheering, but the Bureau of Ships is silent. For the admirals, admitting Higgins is right means admitting their own multi-million-dollar program is a failure. They are locked in a war of the bureaucrats, a battle of egos that threatens to leave the American military toothless as the world burns. But Higgins isn't just a builder, he's a gambler who plays for keeps. He knows the Navy is still obsessed with the idea that soldiers must climb over the sides of the boat. He's seen the intelligence reports from the Pacific. He knows the Japanese Daihatsu craft have ramps. He knows that in a real invasion, the 2 seconds a soldier spends climbing over a gunwale is the difference between a successful landing and a massacre. "You want a ramp?" Higgins barked during a heated meeting in a Mahogany Row office. "I'll give you a ramp that won't sink the damn boat." He returns to New Orleans and turns his factory into a war room. He gathers his best carpenters and engineers, men who have spent their lives building luggers for the swamp. They take the Eureka's proven hull and perform a radical surgery. They saw off the elegant, curved spoonbill bow, the very feature that made the boat famous, and replace it with a flat, vertical face. To maintain the buoyancy, Higgins extends the V of the hull all the way to the front, creating a specialized air chamber. Then comes the centerpiece, a massive 10-gauge steel ramp held in place by heavy-duty cables and a manual winch. The Navy sends a skeptical observer to watch the first test. Higgins doesn't hold back. He loads the boat with a fully equipped platoon and a 3/4-ton truck. He drives the boat at full throttle straight into a concrete seawall. The boat doesn't splinter. It doesn't capsize. The ramp drops with a metallic clang, and the truck rolls onto the pavement in under 3 seconds. That boat, the observer whispers, is a weapon. But the Bureau of Ships still hesitates. They want more tests. They want more paperwork. Higgins, realizing that every day of delay is a day the Nazis used to fortify the Atlantic Wall, makes a move that would have bankrupted any other man. Without a signed contract, without a single cent of government money, he begins buying up every square inch of mahogany and marine-grade plywood in the United States. He corners the market on gray marine diesel engines. He is betting his entire empire on the belief that when the shooting starts, the Navy will have no choice but to come to him. He is building a ghost fleet in the middle of New Orleans, gambling that his plywood boat is the only thing that can turn the impossible invasion into a reality. As the first orders finally trickle in, the scale of the task becomes clear. The Allies don't need dozens of these boats. They don't even need hundreds. They need thousands, and they need them now.
December 1941, 1400 hours. The intersection of City Park Avenue and St. Charles, New Orleans. The air in New Orleans usually moves with the slow, syrupy crawl of the Mississippi, but today it is vibrating. The city doesn't smell like jasmine and scorched sugar anymore. It smells of fresh-cut Philippine mahogany, hot pine tar, and the ozone of 1,000 welding torches. If you stand on the sidewalk, you don't hear the jazz from the French Quarter. You hear the rhythmic, thunderous thwack of hammers and the high-pitched scream of circular saws that never, ever stop. Andrew Higgins hasn't just built a factory. He has turned an entire American city into a singular, sprawling machine. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, the Navy's War of the Bureaucrats ended in a heartbeat. The admirals who had called his boats plywood toys were suddenly on his doorstep, hat in hand, asking for more vessels than any shipyard in history had ever produced. But Higgins doesn't have enough room. He looks at his crowded plant and then looks out at the city streets. In a move that local officials call insane, he begins to seize outdoor lots, streetcar barns, and even entire blocks of the city. He sets up massive tents and open-air assembly lines right on the pavement. He is building the ghost fleet in plain sight. The workforce is the most radical part of the miracle. In the 1940s, the American South is a landscape of a rigid Jim Crow segregation and gender barriers. But Higgins is a man who measures a person only by the speed of their hammer. He looks at the help wanted signs across the country and tears them down. He hires anyone who can do the work. You see it as you walk the line. White men working shoulder to shoulder with black men, women in bandanas leaning over engine mounts, people with physical disabilities operating precision lathes. At Higgins Industries, there is no men's work or women's work. There is only the boat. He pays them all the same wage based on their skill, a move that sends shockwaves through the New Orleans social order. He tells the critics that he doesn't have time for prejudice. He has a war to win. "I don't want to hear why it can't be done," Higgins bellows as he stalks through the City Park plant, his suit jacket discarded and his white shirt translucent with sweat. "If we don't have the steel, find a substitute. If the engine blocks are late, build our own. We are not just building boats, we are building a bridge to the enemy. The assembly line is a masterpiece of impossible logistics. Most ships are built in a dry dock, static and slow. Higgins adapts the moving assembly line of the Detroit auto giants to naval construction. The LCVPs move through the factory on a massive conveyor system. One crew attaches the mahogany side panels, the next installs the armored spoonbill floor, the third drops in the 225 horsepower gray marine diesel engine. By the time the boat reaches the end of the line, it is hoisted onto a flatbed truck and rushed to the waterfront. It is a birth rate that defies belief. In 1940, Higgins had only 75 employees. By 1943, he has over 25,000. They are churning out LCVPs at a rate of nearly one every few hours. But it isn't just the speed, it's the ruggedness. The Navy remains skeptical of the wood construction, fearing that one German bullet will turn the boat into a floating pile of splinters. Higgins proves them wrong with a demonstration of Higgins-style durability. He takes a finished LCVP, empty of its crew, and has a machine gunner fire a full belt into the side. The mahogany doesn't shatter like steel. Because it's layered and flexible, the wood absorbs the impact. The holes are small and localized. A soldier can patch a bullet hole in a Higgins boat with a wooden plug and a hammer in 10 seconds. The plywood isn't a weakness, it is a secret weapon. It is light enough to be hoisted onto the davits of a transport ship, yet tough enough to take a beating from a coral reef that would tear the bottom out of a steel lighter. As 1943 rolls into 1944, the New Orleans swamp rat has produced over 20,000 vessels. They are being loaded onto freighters and sent to every corner of the globe, to the bloody sands of Guadalcanal, the freezing shores of Attu, and the sun-drenched beaches of Sicily. But the ultimate test, the one Higgins has been preparing for since he first sketched the Eureka in the mud, is looming. In England, General Dwight Eisenhower is looking at a map of a place called Normandy. He knows he has the men, he knows he has the tanks, but as he stares at the English Channel, he realizes that all of it is useless unless he can get it across that last 1,000 yards of water. The impossible invasion is no longer a question of courage. It is a question of how many plywood boxes Andrew Higgins can deliver.
June 6, 1944, 07:15 hours. Dog Green Sector, Omaha Beach. The world has narrowed down to the vibrating steel of the bow ramp. You can no longer hear the individual cracks of rifles. The sound has merged into a single terrifying roar of high explosives and the screaming of the wind. The LCVP's hull is groaning as the surf slams it into the shingle. To the men inside, this plywood box is the only thing standing between them and the cold Atlantic, but to the German gunners in the pillboxes above, these boats are the primary targets. A 75mm shell from a hidden castmate screams over the water, striking an LCVP 50 yards to your left. The boat doesn't just sink, it disintegrates in a shower of mahogany splinters and diesel fire. But for every boat that is hit, 10 more are heading the sand. It is a swarm that the Atlantic Wall was never designed to stop. The Germans expected a few hundred ships at a port. They did not expect 10,000 wooden boats appearing simultaneously along 50 miles of open coastline. The coxswain, his knuckles white on the wheel, keeps the engine pinned forward. He has to keep the pressure on the beach, or the backwash will pull the boat sideways and broach it, turning it into a wall of timber that will trap the men inside. "Ramp down," he screams. The steel cable snaps taut, and the ramp falls. For a split second, there is a vacuum of silence before the first MG-42 burst zips into the boat. The men of the 29th Infantry Division surge forward, stumbling into knee-deep water. They are terrified, they are exhausted, but they are on the beach. Without the Higgins boat, they would have been forced to jump into 10 feet of water or wait for a port that would never be captured. As the last man clears the ramp, the coxswain doesn't hesitate. He throws the gray marine engine into a violent reverse. The specialized spoonbill hull lifts, the protected propeller bites into the clean water behind the boat, and the LCVP slides off the sand like it was greased. It doesn't get stuck. It doesn't stall. It turns about and heads back into the fog to pick up the next wave of reinforcements. By the end of the day, the impossible invasion has become a beachhead. Over 150,000 men and thousands of vehicles have been funneled through the ramps of Andrew Higgins' plywood fleet. The tactical deadlock that had paralyzed military planners for a generation was broken by a man who built boats for the Louisiana bayou. Years later, in 1964, General Dwight Eisenhower sat for an interview at his home. When asked which individual was most responsible for the Allied victory in Europe, he didn't name a general, a politician, or a scientist. "Andrew Higgins," Eisenhower said, his voice steady and certain. "He is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. The swamp rat from New Orleans had done more than just build a boat. He had built the bridge that allowed civilization to return to the continent. He had taken a simple idea, a boat that could jump a log, and turned it into the mechanical heartbeat of the Allied cause. Today, the LCVP is a rare sight, most of them having rotted away in the surf of distant islands or been broken up for scrap. But every time a student of history looks at the map of Normandy, they see the ghost of a plywood box. They see the legacy of a man who refused to believe in the word impossible, and in doing so, ensured that the doors of occupied Europe were finally kicked open.